me at any time if you have a question or if you want to have more or less detail as I walk through it. I did bring some paper copies of the proposed rule that was sent.
Pass those around and
I have one extra one here.
Okay, good.
Looks like.
And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself again, because we just
Sure.
started the recording.
Sure. So I'm Morgan Griffith, agrochemical program manager with Farm Division at the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. So we've been talking about neonics for quite a few years. So I thought it was helpful just to kind of put out in a timeline to show where we're at today. Because I think it is pretty confusing of what BMPs are where. So first, it all, not all started, but kind of this movement started in Act 145 in 2022. So that act gave responsibility to the Ag Innovation Board, the AIB, to look into neonic treated seeds. So they required, first, they had to issue a report on BMPs for non-neonic treated article seeds. So that was submitted in February of 2023. Basically, that was really short because what the AIB learned is that they weren't accessible. So there were no such thing right then as non-neonic treated article seeds. So then to fulfill their requirements that were spelled out in Act 145, the AIB issued recommendations for best management practices for neonic treated article seeds. So that was in January of 2024.
Question here, sorry, Representative.
Go ahead.
So a non-neonic treated article seed would be like with a fungicide on it or?
Fungicide only basically is what they were learning about. And basically that was what is limited to no availability at that time when they were reading about it.
Companies just don't sell them like that.
Right. So the recommendations for best management practices for neonic treated seeds, I came in and talked to you guys about that recommendation in 2024. Basically, that recommendation from AIB was they recommended more research to understand the issue in Vermont and to really promote education of growers so that they could learn more about practices that can reduce pest pressure, but then also to reduce any potential non-target exposures from the use of neonic treated seeds. So with that recommendation, the agency, so I kind of wear two hats with AIB and then with agency. The agency took those recommendations and then still fulfilled our requirement to submit best management practices for use of neonic treated seeds. It was submitted as in March of 2024 as BMPs for the use of insecticide treated seeds. So based on conversations at that time, it was leaning towards a more broad take of that. So we were trying to kind of be a little bit predictive of where things were going, and we made those BMPs broad as all insecticide instead of just neonic treated seeds. We were wrong. It was just neonic treated seeds. But so after that came the passage of Act 182. So that is what Mike O'Grady went over with you last week. So that includes, so basically amended that original Act 145. And it includes prohibitions of neonic treated seeds and certain uses of neonic pesticides. And it expanded the scope of AIB to now include best management practices for not only neonic treated seeds, but also neonic pesticides. So based on that legislation, we have now, so February 6th of this year, we submitted this proposed rule, which is the best management practices for neonic treated seeds and neonic pesticides. So that's where we're at today, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So this I'm going to go over quickly because I actually am scheduled to come back on Thursday to talk through AIB's 2024 annual report. So the majority of that report is basically how they made the recommendation to expand from neonic treated seeds to neonic pesticides. But basically where these BMPs came from is first the insecticide treated article BMPs that were made based on their original recommendation and how they've learned for 2.5 years now about all the previous research that's done in Canada and other universities at UVM, and then have researched and reviewed all previously published best management practices. So I'll go over this more, but basically these are 2 documents that try to summarize where our BMPs came from. So the first one is just a list of resources for treated seed best management practices and general neonic best management practices. And the second one is a chart that AIB used to categorize specific BMPs, and then to include the citation of where they were coming from. So this is when they started to pull out the ones that were important to them and which ones should be involved. So my plan for the proposed rule is just to go section by section. So the first section explains the enabling legislation and the purpose. So the purpose is these are best management practices, BMPs, for the appropriate use of neonic treated seeds and neonic pesticides. The AIB recommended that this rule use the traditional definition of BMPs in that they are recommended practices to be used whenever reasonable and practical. So this is in alignment with their recommendation for continued research to understand what is driving pest pressures and to understand potential off-target movement of neonics. So you heard from Dr. Darby last week. So we've supported that research with her and collaborated with her to understand between AIB what AIB is looking for and recommending, and helping her to keep learning Vermont specifics.
Representative O'Brien.
So just
Go ahead.
once again on Heather Darby, like we learned last week, right? She not only found a fungicide only treated article to do research, but also an organic. It was like spinosad or something.
Yep.
So how would one come by
So
those things? Is that
you have to ask her where she got them from.
Yeah.
I do believe she also bought very limited quantities but also maybe in collaboration with Cornell, because that was a in conjunction
Right.
study. So I don't know exactly where she got them from, but I do know that she also ordered them more than a year in advance. Well, good question. So section 2 is our definitions. So most of the definitions are from statute or the pesticide rule. Is really important for us to maintain consistency of terms, because we're all talking about, make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Some of the definitions had to be included here because our typical pesticide definitions don't include reference to treated seed. So some of the definitions had to be reiterated here instead of just referenced to the rule, because we had to add the component for treated seed.
I'm just looking at the definitions here, and I seem to recall last year when we were looking at the definition of integrated pest management, that there was some discussion in the committee, and the reference here is, it says it has the same meaning as defined in some other rule. I wonder maybe when you're back at the end of the week, if we could also just look a little bit about what that other rule is, so we can see what the definition.
Yeah, I do believe it's referencing the pesticide rule. Is it
Yeah.
referencing the pesticide rule?
Yeah, control for the rule for control of pesticides.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was in our way of maintaining consistency rather than throw another
Sure.
definition out there by PM. But yeah, I can definitely add it for Thursday. Section 3. So now we're in the meat of the BMPs, right? So section 3 are the best management practices for the use of neonic treated article seeds. So 3.01 is the applicability statement. This is from statute, saying this section shall apply to neonic treated seeds used prior to January 1st, 2031, and when used under an exemption order. So obviously, this is something that can be amended during the rulemaking process. But so we initially drafted this to align with the date that's in the statute. So this part of the statute that talks about us adopting a rule says this should apply for neonic treated seeds when used prior to January 1st, 2031. But we can change it to 2029, because that's when the prohibition actually is effective. But right now,
End up being 2031. Can you just remind us?
my guess, I don't know for sure. My guess is that there was some discussion, if I remember correctly, of pushing it farther out to learn from New York. So New York's is 2029.
Mhm.
So I do think that there was some discussion during the amendments of this before it was passed that, well, let's see how they do it. Let's push ours to 2031. And I think this got changed, but it just didn't get changed back. So I think that was just where it got a little wonky. So right now, just because this is the way that it's written, that's the way we put it in the proposed rule, but we can obviously change it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So section 3.02, so users of neonic treated seeds should comply with the seed label requirements. So for example, proper handling, storage, use, and disposal, follow the planting rate that's recommended and the depth of planting, and also any restrictions and hazard statements that are relative to pollinators. So we wanted to give you an example of what these seed bag labels look like. So this is a corn variety. It's treated with clothianidin, which is a neonic, and also chlorantraniliprole, which is a diamide, and also fungicides. So this is some of the language that you can see on this seed bag label. So first you see the initial caution statements. Don't allow children or pets or livestock to access it, store away from food and feed. Don't use the empty bag for any other purposes. There's also some PPE listed, personal protective equipment for the user. And then you have the environmental risks. So saying that a compound on the seed is toxic to birds and mammals. And so if the treated seed is exposed on the soil surface, it can be hazardous to those animals. Also, the label states to reduce seed dust, you should ensure that your planting equipment is functioning properly and in accordance with the manufacturing recommendations. You see the statements, do not plant by broadcasting on surface, plant at recommended minimum depth, cover and collect all spilled treated seeds. It gives the option to, you can double sow them or bury them away from water sources, and do not contaminate water when disposing of equipment wash water. So more language that's on the seed bag.
One other question here.
Yeah.
Morgan, as it stands now, farmers don't have to be like custom applicators to do this. They just have to follow the labels to put in.
Right. So this is again part of that exemption. So this label is here, but this is not the same as a pesticide label. So a pesticide label, federal law if you break a pesticide label, because this is a treated seed, the label is not the law.
So if I was a farmer, I planted neonic treated seeds, then wanted to come back and do a foliar spray when they germinate. I mean, when they're up above the ground, is that a different? Do I need to be a?
So that's interesting. So part of that, I'm going to get to a little bit of that answer because so sometimes there's a limit to your total active ingredient that you can apply. So in that case, your pesticide label will say that limit, but your treated seed active ingredient applies to that maximum limit. So it's kind of confused. So you can use the restrictions of the pesticide label to enforce that. So this language is for pollinators. So it calls out some pollinator specific risks. It calls out compounds in this product are highly toxic to bees. We all know that that is the clothianidin. So it has the same statement, ensure the equipment is functioning to minimize seed abrasion and to reduce dust. It has groundwater and surface water advisories, which serve to kind of basically educate the user as to the risks that are associated with use of the neonic treated seeds. It also has statements to avoid planting when rain is forecast within 48 hours. That's to reduce runoff. And then at the very bottom of this, you'll see that your depth statement. So it said treated seed must be planted into the soil at a depth greater than 1.5 to 2 inches. So this gets at what you were just asking about. So this is clothianidin has the restriction that it has a yearly limit of 0.1 pounds per acre per year. So these treated seeds that you're planting counts towards that total. And it actually specifically calls out planting cannot be followed by a spray treatment of another neonic insecticide. Yeah, go ahead.
Is this language you were just showing us, this is proposed from the AAB, or
This is
on
pulled-
labels already?
This is pulled straight from a label. I just didn't show you the first
So who developed this language?
page. So this, I believe, is a Corteva product, I think, or at least it's a Pioneer product. So they have specific things that they have to include, which I believe are, as a PPE, that the major caution statements at the top and what is on the seed. But all of these other things are included because of, it's not mandatory to be on there. It's kind of this wishy-washy, which we, I know that you guys have learned of the use of the clothianidin onto the seed is a pesticide application, right? So you have to follow the label of that clothianidin seed treatment label of applying it onto the seed. But then just the seed itself is not a pesticide, right? It's only been treated with a pesticide.
So is it USDA or EPA that's?
So I think it's still EPA, but they're not doing it. But yeah, you can go ahead.
You want to jump in?
Yes, yeah, for the record, Steve Royal, the Agency of Agriculture Department. So when a product is approved by EPA to be applied as a seed treatment, part of the requirement is that you apply that treatment to the seed, you have to include the information from the pesticide label on the seed tag. So essentially, it's a pass through of all the requirements that are on the label have to go on the seed tag.
So it's all federal language.
Yeah, it's all
EPA,
federal.
yeah. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so I'm back into the proposed rule now. So section 3.04 are best management practices for neonic treated seeds that are practices to reduce dust generation and potential non-target exposure. So users of the treated seed should avoid windy conditions, especially if the direction of the wind is towards flowering crops or surface water. Users should reduce dust generation by handling the bags carefully and using a dust reducing seed lubricant, which you heard Heather talk about. So she is looking into the efficacy of those seed lubricants. I will point out AIB has learned and heard from Canada. So graphite and talc are banned in Canada because of their potential for being more abrasive. So the best management practice is included here of calibrating your equipment. You saw that on the label. Also loading the planter inside the field. So it says at least 10 yards inside the field. So that's more to keep anything that could be admitted when you're dumping the bags in, kind of where you want the treatment to go anyway, instead of going off your target field. And don't use compressed air when you clean your planter. So continuing our dust generation and non-target exposure, BMPs, the ones listed here are similar to what we saw on the example seed bag label. So don't broadcast plant. Users shouldn't contaminate water or pollinator attractive habitats when you're cleaning your equipment, and incorporate all seeds so that no seeds are left exposed. So section 3.05 focuses on IPM, integrated pest management strategies, when using neonic treated seeds. So for example, utilize other practices, so cultural, mechanical, biological, to help reduce the risk of pest damage. and also choose the lowest appropriate rate of neonics that will effectively manage the target pest. So Heather did mention, you do have a choice of rate of neonic. You don't have an expansive amount of choice, but at least you have a high and a low. Go ahead.
Representative Nelson.
I have bought a prodigious amount of corn seed in my life. And no one has ever given me the option of choosing how much neonic is on the seed.
Do you have, do you know of it's usually like a number, like 1,200 or 2,500?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I look at hybrids that will bring nutrition to the cattle and their relative maturity date length. And as far as I know, if you order 93U from Brabant, that no one's ever said, do you want this level or this level? It essentially, it just comes as that level.
I think the AIB heard similar things, and also our members. So we have Amanda St. Pierre as a member of the conventional dairy farmer in Vermont, and so she also communicated that, and I think that was part of the reason why this is a should, right? This is a should statement because availability is obviously going to change based on the passage of 182, right? So we don't know what is going to be there or available come 2029. But in the meantime, that statement is there, but it might not always be reasonable or practical for a farmer to follow that statement based on availability.
No.
Yeah. But kind of along that vein, so 3.06 focuses on communication and continuous education. So first is communication. So a person using neonic treated seeds should notify anyone with an apiary on the property, provided that the hive locations and the contact information is available to the person planting the seeds. And then the second 1B here is a person using a neonic treated seeds should attend available education and outreach programs through either University Extension or the seed industry about best management practices for neonic article seeds. And I think that education component is important because then it could maybe educate people to ask, that at least maybe then it's an ask, well, hey, is there another rate available of this? So it kind of, I think the AIB recognized that it might not be clearly communicated to everyone of what's available. It might just be, this is what we have, this is what you get kind of salesman techniques. So section 3.07 includes BMPs for proper storage. So similar language here as we saw on the example label. And 3.08 is disposal. So same thing here, kind of pulls from seed bag label language. Also, it calls out that a person using a neonic treated seed should not recycle the container. They should not compost the treated seed. You shouldn't burn it in a stove that's inside. And you shouldn't use it for fuel or ethanol production purposes.
Yeah, don't feed your cows.
Yeah, so I did, that was the top of the label one, don't use it as feed. We didn't, yeah, so that kind of falls under, that's a mandatory seed bag label.
And Nelson.
So, going back to the level of pesticide on a seed, there are hybrids out there. Like Channel had one, 19206, 19208, 19210, and maybe 19207. 19206 was an untreated seed. It didn't even have glyphosate protection. It was just, the genomics of that seed in there. And then from there on up, you got different level above ground or below ground protection. Not counting the seed treatment, but you got, all the way up through to maybe that one didn't have Western bean cutworm protection, but had everything else. So you had, but as far as the seed treatment goes, I've never seen different options.
Mhm. Go ahead,
Steve,
Steve.
you want to respond?
Yes, Steve, I'm here. Yeah, so, in discussion with the seed companies in the AIB and outside the AIB, what they are saying is that so they have genetic packages which they provide farmers. They have different levels of protection, both plant incorporated protectants and genetic packages of resistance to herbicides. But what they're saying is, so those, they have a lot of money invested in those seeds and the
Mhm.
technology and this patent and everything. They have stated that they will not provide those seeds unless they're protected. Because they don't want to be liable for a crop failure. Those seeds are expensive. And they don't want to be liable, to a grower if the seed gets planted and then they have an insect problem. So their policy is to, the higher level seed that has the additional stuff, they don't provide it unless they've also completed a fungicide and insecticide treatment. System.
Let's take one more question, then I want to make sure that we're on schedule to be need to break a little early to get downstairs, but go ahead, Representative O'Brien.
Morgan, I just wondered if there were treated article seeds that being sold in Vermont that are not farm bound, so like certain grass seeds or certain vegetable seeds.
Yes.
I could buy for my gardens, and do they have similar labels on them?
No. Not that I'm aware of.
Very minimal.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
they're out there. Okay, so to make sure that you guys get out of here to get downstairs. So section 4, now we're shifting from treated seeds to neonic pesticides. So these are the best management practices for use of neonic pesticides. This section is applicable to the uses prohibited after July 1st, 2025. And or when they're used under an exemption order. And then I just want to say here that this exemption order, so if you have an exemption order, that's an opportunity to make some of these best management practices as provisions in that order. Think of that order as like a permit. So those can be permitted provisions that make them required. So an exemption order either for the neonic treated seeds or now for the neonic pesticides. So if an exemption order is granted, that's an opportunity for the Agency of Agriculture to put best management practices as provisions of that order. So making them mandatory instead of best management practices, instead of recommended practices. So also here, 401C is a really important point. So this is a shall statement, right? So that any use of a neonic pesticide shall be in compliance with the product label and the pesticide rule. So those two things take precedence, and that those are mandatory enforceable requirements for the use of neonic pesticides. So section 4.02 are your traditional IPM best management practices for neonic pesticides. So it includes scouting and monitoring, seeing if your economic thresholds have been met to understand if, when, and where neonics should be applied. Also utilization of multiple pest management methods, so to avoid and reduce your pest risk and damage. So section 4.03 addresses specifically best management practices to reduce drift. So users of neonic pesticides should spray during favorable weather conditions, maintain buffers from surface water, ensure your application equipment is calibrated and functioning properly. In here we have, I know the AIB specifically recommended comply with the rule and all applicable permit conditions for aerial applications. That was a specific ad per AIB. So same with the seed label, we wanted to show you an example of a neonic pesticide label. So you could see many of these drift reduction BMPs as mandatory language on a product label. So all of these snippets that you'll see come up are from one product. It's an imidacloprid product. It's labeled for vegetables and fruit. And so all neonics that are labeled for outdoor use will have this B box, it's called. So it draws your attention. There's not many graphics outside of the name of the pesticide on a label. So it pulls your attention with a B graphic. So neonics are high, it calls out that it's indicated that it's highly toxic to bees and pollinators, and then points the user to the directions for use for specific restrictions. So to reduce drift, some of the language that's on this label has wind speed restrictions, so do not apply if winds are greater than 15 miles per hour. It restricts the application during temperature inversions. So that basically holds a spray down, so it doesn't let the droplets dissipate upwards in the atmosphere. And instead, during a temperature inversion, it holds it down so that they're highly likely to go sideways off target instead of being able to just go up. The language also has some BMPs for air blast applications common in apple orchards. And so it directs how your deflector should be, your not spraying double-sided when you're on the outside row, things like that. And also a mandatory buffer of 25 feet by ground or 150 feet by air of bodies of water. So this is a mandatory requirement on this label. So section.
Sorry, just wanted to ask whether it's a mandatory requirement on all labels. So anybody selling that product, this is one of the EPA requirements, or?
So it probably is. It's on the label because EPA said, hey, if this is a imidacloprid product, so hey, imidacloprid, if it's used in this way, you need to have these buffers, right? So all of these are from one label, but it's coming from that review of EPA of that chemical. So section 4.04 is some BMPs to prevent spills. You can see similar language. So the BMPs that are listed, basically word for word, this is on the label in red there. So if a containment pad is not used during mixing and loading, maintain a minimum distance of 25 feet between the mixing and loading area and potential surface to groundwater conduits. So also, as a reminder, like the pesticide rule has a significant spill section as well as do the labels, so it might seem like these BMPs are sparse, but that's because we didn't want to repeat anything that was in the pesticide rule that is applicable to neonic pesticides. So 4.05 is runoff. So we did drift, we did spills. Now we're on runoff prevention measures. So best management practices here are avoiding applications in rain or if rain is predicted, and keeping vegetative buffers, so near your tile outlets or along boundaries, and utilizing other residue management practices like no-till and things like that to slow your runoff. So example from the label is do not cultivate within 10 feet of aquatic areas to allow growth of vegetative filter strip. .06 is our pollinator protection best management practices. So the focus here is on communication. Hives that might be on site, follow the label, and then also make applications when conditions are not conducive to pollinator flight. So I'm bringing back, so now remember we were referred to the directions for use of the label. So now this is what part of that directions for use looks like. They have strict restrictions, and it's divided between crops that are under pollinators services, and then crops that are not using pollinator services. So it has do not apply while bees are foraging, do not apply until flowering is complete unless the following conditions are met. And that is, the condition is you have to notify the pollinator services that are on site so that they have time to remove, cover, or protect those pollinators. So this is a continuation of that directions for use. This is for when you don't have pollinator services for your crop. So similar, don't apply while foraging, don't apply until flowering is complete unless one of the conditions is met. These conditions listed are to avoid contact with pollinators, right? So either make your application after sunset, under 55 degrees, make it in accordance with any apiary registry program that notifies beekeepers 48 hours beforehand so they can protect. And we do have that, so that is the state administered. So that is part of our rule. I'll bring it up in the next slide. But then the bottom of this box is for non-ag uses. There's no conditions. It's just a straight up restriction. Do not apply while bees are foraging. Do not apply this product to plants that are flowering, and only apply after all flower petals have fallen. So this snippet is from the rule. So this is the pesticide rule. So this language from the rule is taken from the pollinator protection report that was issued in 2017. And so this section, 504A, is no person shall apply a pesticide to a flowering crop without that prior notification to any beekeeper who has hives on site. And then C applies to neonic pesticides. So neonic pesticides are highly toxic to bees. So therefore, a person applying neonics shall apply the pesticide during periods and conditions of least exposure, such as early morning, late evening, and when winds are less than 9. And they have to include a 50-foot buffer from pollinator foraging sites or have a 20-foot wide non-pollinator attractive vegetative barrier. So this is in the rule. This is enforceable. People applying neonic pesticides have to comply with this. And the last part of the label, so it even now goes even further restrictive by crop. So if you look at a label, it usually gives specific for crops that it's labeled to be used on. So for example, when this imidacloprid product is used on strawberries, that last bullet says do not apply during bloom or within 10 days prior to bloom or when bees are foraging. So no conditions, just do not apply. And then on palm fruit, like apples, do not apply pre-bloom or during bloom or when bees are foraging. So that's a straight up restriction for those uses. So label language for neonic pesticides provide mandatory restrictions, and then those will be in addition to the rule, and in addition, then these best management practices are on top of those mandatory ones. Then we have our recommended best management practices. So the last two sections, this is just, your standard rule language, your severability clause, and your effective date. And then where are we right now in our rulemaking process? So we sent this to committees in February. And actually, so early April, we sent out the proposed rule to other agencies that could potentially be impacted by the rule. And so actually yesterday, we just met with several divisions of ANR and went through their comments on the proposed rule. So right now we're editing to incorporate those comments. And then, so it's going to be slightly different when we file in the next day or two because we've incorporated their comments in this. And so then we anticipate filing to hopefully be on the ICAR meeting for May.
Can you remind us what ICAR stands for?
Interagency, yeah. Zach is leading our rulemaking. So Zach Zukowski here is leading our rulemaking process.
Yeah,
So go ahead, Zach.
Zach Shkowski, Agency of Agriculture, is the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules.
Interagency.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So we tried to prepare for that, right? And so give people a heads up even before the ICAR meeting. And so we've sent it to some agencies we thought might be impacted and had a really productive meeting yesterday with ANR. So, and that's all I have. So happy to
Okay.
answer any more questions.
Great. Well, maybe, thank you. And if there aren't any other questions, thank you for walking through in such detail. Maybe we'll ask Mike O'Grady to come up, and I know he was here for at least part of the conversation. And as I mentioned to the committee, like before, I think before you got here, we had originally hoped that you would lead off this conversation just to give us context on what rules are, where do they fit, how does the legislature look at rules, where they come from? What's the role of the legislature going forward? Committee members are wondering, why are we looking at this? So if we do, since we all have to be downstairs in 15 minutes, we probably should keep this conversation to another 6 or 7 minutes, I think, and then break and go down.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to talk generally then. In Act 182, you required the agency to propose best management practices for the use of neonicotinoid treated seeds and neonicotinoid pesticides, and you're required to do that by rule. You phased in their rulemaking so that you saw a draft of it, and then there was a requirement that before they went to final rulemaking or filing a final rule, that they had to give you a draft for review. And what does that mean, final rulemaking? Well, the APA is an 8-month process, and starting with the interagency on administrative rules. So they're just starting with their rulemaking if they're just about to file with their interagency. So they're going to have whatever time period that they will take to take public comment. Respond to public comment. They'll probably have a public hearing or two for a rule like this. And then they're supposed to respond to the comments and amend the rule. And then when they're done with that, they submit that rule to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State submits it to you. LCAR. And LCAR has the ability to review a rule for, depending on what you consider, about 4 to 6 different criteria. They look to see whether or not it's consistent with statute. And right away, this rule isn't consistent with statute because you got a 2031 date when it should be a 2029 date. So I would have, when I'm required to look at these rules, and one of the first things I would have said is that the rule conflicts with statutory authority. The next thing you're supposed to look at is legislative intent. And I don't really like to opine on legislative intent because you are all the legislators, and what your intent is all individual to you, and it varies greatly. But there's one of the things in 182 is when the AIB, the agency, when the agency in consultation with the AIB was drafting these rules, putting them together, they were supposed to consider many things, such as threshold levels of pest pressure required prior to use of a neonicotinoid seed or a neonicotinoid pesticide, availability of untreated neonicotinoid seed, economic impact from crop losses compared to crop yield when neonicotinoid seed or neonicotinoid pesticides are used, relative toxicities and differences. I don't know if they addressed all of these. I went back and I looked at the AIB proceedings, and there's definitely testimony that refers to some of these, and there's advocates that provided input on the various factors. But I raise that because those are things that a legislator could look at and say, these rules don't meet the legislative intent because you didn't do these certain things and these rules don't address them. I don't opine on that. That's not but that's a possibility. The third thing that the LCAR will look at is whether or not it's arbitrary and capricious effectively whether or not there's a rational basis for the adoption or the provisions in the rule. You know, you probably can make an argument that all of these meet the LCAR definition of arbitrary, or of not being arbitrary and capricious, but it's a fairly wide standard. So again, if there are advocates or legislators that are disagreeing with this, they probably have an opportunity to make an argument to object as arbitrary and capricious. I don't know. I probably, when I review the rule, I probably wouldn't recommend that, but I'm just putting that on the table. And then what happens if LCAR objects? The agency has ability to cure. Most of the time, the agency does. If they don't object, they can go forward with the rule as proposed, even with the objectionable language, but that shifts the burden of proof for that part of the rule that the agency, that LCAR objected to. So you just saw one of those types of rules, the trapping rules. LCAR objected to 4 components of the trapping rules. The board, Fish and Wildlife Board, said we don't care, and went forward with their rules. And now there's litigation regarding those components that LCAR objected to. So because when LCAR objects, and because advocates are usually involved or support objection, agencies often don't go forward in the face of objection. When they do, it usually leads to some form of litigation. I think the rule generally looks good. I found it a little confusing. The shoulds versus the shalls, like where is the shall versus the should? And many of I just heard testimony saying, oh, this is a shall, this is a mandate, it's in the rule, but the lead-in language says it's a should. So I'm not sure where the distinction is being made between shall and should. And that's probably just something I would sit down with Steve or someone from the Steves and just say, where is this? Because that's what we do. We review, we talk to the chair of the jurisdictional committee. We say, hey, we have these concerns or questions. We send the questions to the agency. The agency usually answers most of them or proposes to fix. And I've never had an issue with the Agency of Ag in that kind of process. They're really easy to work with.
That was said, staff child, baby. Get right up.
Room 11 talking.
Somebody's not muted.
Sedania.
Yeah.
So in any event, that's kind of, my 10,000 foot level, but
Now that's very helpful in 7 minutes to have outlined that. So LCAR, we heard about ICAR, which is interagency. LCAR is legislative committee.
yes, Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. I haven't been in there this session, so I don't.
It's a group of 7 or 8, or I'm not sure how many of our
Usually eight, four.
appointed House and Senate,
Yep.
and they meet from time to time throughout the year, right? Off session also.
During session, they meet weekly. Off session, it's supposed to be at least once a month, but sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. It's usually dependent on the demand on their agenda.
I would say when we were back at the end of the week, is it Thursday, Friday? I can't remember.
Thursday.
Come back. If I don't know whether we have you coming to, but if people have questions about this generically, about the process or about the specific, illustration that we're looking at, we can spend a little more time talking about that too. Why don't we break? We're supposed to be starting up again at 2 in room 11. So thank you, everybody, for coming in. Appreciate your testimony.
You all go to room 11.
Yeah.